Hey, I want to talk about a specific issue in this video, and it's related to a previous video I made on the power of nations. So I probably covered some of this in that video, but I want to talk about a specific thing. The issue is military power or prominence in relation to the development of a nation in terms of how powerful a nation is seen. Now, I don't want to focus too much on specific cases in this, although inevitably I might have to mention some to weigh up my points, but um, it struck me that a lot of people, when they look at the power of a nation, they focus especially on the military power, and probably second to that, they look at economic power. Um, my own view is that both issues are important, and they certainly, well, not just important, they're critical in terms of a nation's power, in terms of the external threats it may face, in terms of defending itself, and in terms of being a player on the world stage. So unquestionably, military power and economic weight have some credibility in that argument. Um, Incidentally, with economics, we need to think about the difference between GDP and GDP per head of population. So, for example, you get some small countries that have a very are extremely wealthy, but they wouldn't be seen as a big economy. For example, Qatar, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, they're incredibly wealthy, but they're not big economies. They're not seen as big economies. You get other countries like the United States, China that have very big economies. Um, well, China's probably a better example to look at because the US is wealthy as well, although obviously it's not. That can't be said for every American. There's also some crippling poverty in the US, but I'll use China perhaps as a better example to exemplify this point. China is second in the world, possibly first by some measures, in terms of the size of its economy, but its actual GDP per head is somewhere around 96th. And I've even seen Chinese nationalists admit that fact. They know that it's not a wealthy country, but it's a developing country. That doesn't mean it's as dirt poor as some places, but it's important to look at the difference between GDP, i.e., the size of the economy, and GDP per head of population. Again, the UK, we're about sixth in terms of GDP size, but we're only 22nd in terms of, well, 22nd is still obviously in the upper half, but there's quite a big discrepancy between that. The United States, I believe, is first or second in terms of overall GDP size, and it's about sixth or seventh in terms of GDP per head of population. There's a few countries that are above the United States in that regard. But anyway, this video is not about economics, it's about the military aspect. Um, I think that I mean, obviously, if you're from a pacifist background, then anything to do with the military is going to be very off-putting. But personally, I'm not a pacifist, and I'm a political realist, and this is a dangerous world, and I believe that countries should have some sort of mechanism to defend themselves. Clearly, there are some militaries that are a lot more developed than others, either because they were established earlier, because they're part of a bigger economy, because the government of that country puts more into its defense budget. There's a lot of different reasons. Some obvious examples is the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, France, China. They could all be seen as powerful militaries, and they're not unique. There's others as well. I'm just giving those as some examples. Um, but I think it is not entirely. I think to look at the military strength alone would be misleading because the thing is, it's dramatic. It looks like, whoa, you have nukes, you have a massive manpower, etc. Therefore, you're powerful. I think the equation is slightly misleading. And an example I'm going to use for this is North Korea. Now, North Korea has massive manpower, although its actual professional manpower is probably significantly less. Nevertheless, by any measure, it's very big manpower, and they may have one nuclear weapon. But in every other sense, it is an utterly failed state. It is dirt poor. It is an absolute totalitarian regime, and it's the fact that there is no sort of independence of any of its, for example, between the military and between the state, is makes it very, very fragile, actually. because all it takes is a military coup in North Korea and the country is absolutely um, a failed state. And even now, the situation is bad because there is an absolute totalitarian regime. There's a fear factor around, for example, any general wouldn't dare to speak up against Kim Jong Un. So it actually creates a fragile sense. It gives a perception of being powerful, but internally it's actually very weak and very weak in the sense that there is not a confidence. It's a fear. It's not a confident factor. It's a fear factor because the generals in North Korea are absolutely terrified of getting on the wrong side of Kim Jong Un. Generals in other countries can have their own opinions and speak up to the leader of state. They might not necessarily get their own way, but there isn't that same fear factor, nor should there be. And likewise, it shouldn't be a fear factor on the other end either of a military junta. So there should be a situation where civilians can also speak up against the military. In other words, a civilian prime minister should have the power to say when he thinks that something is wrong. So it should be an equilibrium between the military brass and the civilian leader, in my opinion. Um, if you have a situation where one has absolute power over the other, absolute power, then it's problematic because both can be a problem. In the case of North Korea, you have, well, civilian would probably be the wrong word, but you have a dictator who has absolute control over his military. And in other countries, you have the military, which have a control over the civilian population. Probably Thailand would be an interesting example with that, because General Prayut is effectively leader in everything but name. He's supposedly an interim leader, but after following the situation in Thailand, and the man is an absolute dictator. Um, so, military power versus a country's overall progress. Well, I do believe military power is important, and personally, I feel grateful to be in a country. I have absolute confidence in the British Army. I believe we're one of the most professional armies in the world, and I believe that. I know the nuclear issue is controversial, but if I had to make a black and white choice, do we have Trident or we do not have Trident? That's Trident, it's Britain's nuclear program. Although there's valid arguments on both sides, I ultimately come down on the side that we have it, simply because we're living in a world where you can never be sure about the future. There's always a potential threat, and that isn't. I don't believe that's pessimistic talk. I think it's just realistic talk. Um, so I would rather that we were prepared than not prepared. It's as simple as that. Now I know there's many people will say, well, having nuclear weapons causes the threat in the first place and all this sort of stuff. But anyway, I see valid arguments on both sides, and I fully understand, incidentally, why people want to get rid of them. So I do respect people with those views, because I understand where they're coming from. Nuclear weapons are a terrible thing; they cause mass casualties. On the other hand, um, no sane leader of any country is going to attack a country that has nuclear weapons. Especially two nuclear powers will probably do a bit of saber rattling. And I could use this to refer to the video I made about naval tensions in the Pacific. There might be some saber rattling, there might be some name calling, there might be some tensions and everything else between, for example, the US and China. But the chances of an actual physical war, I believe, are quite unlikely, simply because neither Xi Jinping or Barack Obama are idiots. Both men know that that would be absolutely catastrophic. Um, Now, in the case of North Korea, you have, in my opinion, he's a madman. I believe he is actually mentally unstable, referring obviously to Kim Jong Un. So that is a different ballgame. But then I think what happens whenever there's a crisis on the Korean Peninsula is China quietly goes behind closed doors and weighs in on the North Koreans, tells them to sort themselves out. It's a little bit like China's the big brother trying to keep a rein on its delinquent little brother. That's kind of the analogy I would make. Um, but basically, anyway, I want to get to the main point that I'm talking about here. If we have a situation where a country is very powerful militarily, that obviously gives a country and a government the confidence that it can defend itself. But I don't believe it should be the only barometer to measure a country's progress. I mean, pretty much every military power that we can think of, big military power, the countries themselves have serious social problems. If we could look at the United States, it is almost certainly the country's most powerful military, and yet there is very serious problems going on in American society right now. In the UK, we have a powerful military, but we have a growing sense of division in this country. Um, Russia. Russia has a powerful military, but Russia again has some serious social problems. It continues to have serious poverty. There continues to be a big homeless problem. There continues to be severe racism in big Russian cities. So every country, China, needless to say, despite the Communist Party sort of illusions of a harmonious society, China's actually having serious tensions in terms of tensions between its migrant workers and the government because of the way they're treated. And there's been a lot of high-profile protests. I say high-profile, but the government that doesn't mean the government hasn't tried to silence coverage of those events. But China has actually had a lot of unrest in recent years, something the Communist Party doesn't want people to know that has been happening. So what I'm getting at is every country that I've named, every powerful military, the countries themselves we cannot say that they're very stable, very harmonious societies. Now, obviously, the United States and the UK are not about to go into a state of civil war. That's obvious, right? And anyone who's saying that they are clearly exaggerating the situation. So I'm not saying that it's like a complete black and white situation. Like, oh, powerful military means chaos at home. Certainly not. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that just looking at the military factor alone is misleading. Now, I guess the reason I've been prompted to make this video is I've seen a lot of comments online where people have this sort of somewhat childish, but also very egotistical and jingoistic attitude that if their countries happen to have a powerful military, that makes them wonderful and it makes everything about their country great. And it means they can throw the weight around cyberspace. Now, I try to be objective on this. If I see someone sort of attacking the United Kingdom verbally speaking, I try my best not to rise to it, and I try to sort of point out the facts. And if they're saying something that's true, I will acknowledge that. So I do believe I'm objective when it comes to those sort of debates. But generally, I try to avoid military videos, and there's a few reasons for that. It's not because I'm a pacifist. In fact, I find the subject quite interesting. However, there's a few reasons. Number one, I don't know that much about military technology. My knowledge is relatively basic. Perhaps more than people who have no interest, but there's people out there who know more about me than actual weaponry technology and so on. So I don't want to get into a debate when I don't know the subject. It would be a foolish thing to do. Secondly, it gets tiresome because I try, especially in recent months, I've tried to take an approach of responding more to positive messages and positive dialogue rather than constantly having these little cyber battles. It gets tiresome. Um, and I don't think it proves anything anyway. I mean, you could say that I get irritated with anybody, including people from the UK, who use the military as a way to almost use bullying, sort of a bullying attitude to others, like, oh, we will flatten you and we will nuke you and this sort of stuff. People, that says a lot about their mentality that they would joke about that sort of stuff because this is not a joke. Military power is a very real phenomenon and it is something that does potentially mean life and death. So I don't think people should joke about that sort of stuff. Or if they're not joking, then um, well, it just says something about their personality that they think that's something to glorify in. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying anything here against the military. So if you're a soldier, this is not an anti-military statement. I would have liked to think you would have noticed that by now. But all I'm saying is that it shouldn't be used alone to measure a nation's progress. In my opinion, a nation's strength also depends on how it treats all its people. So that does mean human rights. It does mean the welfare of people as a whole. And there's no country in the world that can say it's got an absolutely perfect record in this regard. Some are better than others, but certainly my country is far from perfect. So we have a powerful military. But I do believe that we have some serious social questions to be asked. I mean, the way the Tories are treating the most vulnerable in society is a disgrace. So countries can be powerful militarily or economically, but if the Human Development Index or if the overall welfare of its populace isn't I'm not going to say equal, but if it is not progressive, then that is a problem. So let me know your thoughts on this. My final words on this are that I believe that military power is important for big countries because it is something that self-defense is an absolute critical issue that it goes without saying, especially in an uncertain world. Um, economic, I think economic power is an important thing, but only if the general population is feeling it. Now, in the UK, again, a lot of people are not feeling the recovery. We went through the recession. We've supposedly got out of it now, but a lot of people simply aren't feeling that. That means it is clearly benefiting some areas more than others. Um, so how we measure a nation's progress, in my opinion, is not just about military power or the economy. As important as those things are, I believe that welfare of the nation's people is equally important. That's why some smaller countries could actually call themselves more powerful, might be the wrong word, but more progressive and almost more stable actually than some bigger countries that have a strong military power. Because some small European countries may not have a very powerful military, but they're very peaceful and they have a lot of internal stability. So there's a lot of factors to look at with this. Let me know your thoughts.